The desert was quiet that morning. Too quiet, Clara Whitmore thought, the kind of silence that made even the wind seem like it was holding its breath. Dawn crept slowly over the red mesas, painting the sand in shades of copper and rose, and the first light of day spilled across the small settlement of Dry Creek like an accusation. The town, barely a dozen wooden buildings and a church with a broken steeple, was waking to gossip. Not prayer. Word had spread through Dry Creek like fire in dry grass. Judge Whitmore's daughter-in-law had murdered his son. Clara stood in front of her cabin, wrists bound with rough hemp rope, her nightdress hidden beneath a thin shawl. Her eyes were red from sleeplessness, but her spine was straight. She had learned long ago that weakness in front of the Whitmores invited cruelty. The men surrounding her, her husband's brothers and their wives, looked at her as though she were a rattlesnake coiled to strike. "Best come quiet, Clara," said Elias Whitmore, the eldest. "Pa's waitin'. Your father's been waiting to hang me since the day I said I do," she said quietly, her voice low and steady. Elias spat into the dirt, jaw clenching. "You best watch that tongue, woman." They pushed her toward a wagon hitched to two tired mules. The wheels creaked and the dust rose in ghostly swirls as they rolled toward town. The air was dry, filled with the sharp scent of sage and iron, the smell of rain that never came. As they passed the cemetery on the hill, Clara's eyes fell on a newly dug mound beneath a crude wooden cross. Thomas Whitmore, her husband, dead 3 days. She felt her heart twist. Not because she missed him, not truly. The love between them had been buried long before his body was, beneath bruises, silences, and the coldness of a man who treated her like a trespasser in his family's world. Still, she had not wished him dead. No decent soul would. When they reached the center of town, people were already gathered outside the saloon and the blacksmith's shop. Men leaned on rifle stocks. Women clutched shawls tight around their shoulders. There was no sheriff. There hadn't been for months. Law had left Dry Creek along with the last vein of silver in the hills. What remained was Judge Whitmore, and his word was law enough. He stood on the wooden platform beside the gallows that had been built for outlaws, not widows. His white beard glowed in the rising light, and his eyes, hard, pale blue, fixed on her as though she were a sickness he meant to cure. "Bring her here," he ordered. Clara stepped forward, head held high. She met his gaze without flinching. Behind him, the noose dangled, rough, freshly knotted hemp, the same color as the rope around her wrists. "Clara Whitmore," he said, voice ringing out for all to hear, "you stand accused of the murder of my son, Thomas Whitmore. God rest his soul. Witnesses saw you serve him his last meal. He was dead within the hour." Lies, all of it. Thomas had come home drunk that night, as he often did, and had fallen into a fit before collapsing. She had screamed for help, but no one came. In the morning they found her beside his cold body, the bowl of stew spilled on the floor, and in their grief, they had chosen to call it murder. "I didn't kill him," Clara said simply. Her voice trembled once, but she steadied it. Thomas was sick. He drank too much, and it took him. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The judge lifted a hand, and the noise died. "A convenient tale," he sneered. "A woman like you, born outside the faith, raised without land or name, you brought ruin to my son and disgrace to my family. Now you'll pay for it." Clara's eyes burned with unshed tears. She wanted to scream, to remind them how she had nursed Thomas through fever, how she'd cooked for them all, how she'd buried her pride every day just to be tolerated in their home. But she knew it wouldn't matter. To these people, justice was something decided by bloodlines, not truth. She felt the sun climb higher on her back, the heat growing heavier. The gallows cast a long crooked shadow across the dust. The judge stepped closer. "At noon, the town will see justice done," he said. Pray, Mrs. Whitmore, that your soul fares better than your marriage did." He turned away, leaving her standing beneath the empty noose, a widow. Accused and abandoned, somewhere beyond the edge of town, unseen and silent, a young Apache scout watched from the rocks, his dark eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. He knew her face. He remembered her kindness. And though the desert gave no mercy, he felt something stir inside him, something that would not let this stand. The wind picked up, carrying the dust of the gallows across the town. By noon, justice would hang, or mercy would rise. By mid-morning, the gallows loomed over Dry Creek like a monument to fear. Its timbers were rough and sun-bleached, nailed together in haste by the blacksmith and 2 farmhands under Judge Whitmore's orders. The wood groaned in the rising heat, the noose swinging gently in the wind like a serpent waiting for its prey. The townspeople had gathered early, drawn by the promise of something to talk about in a place where days were long and empty. Mothers held their children close. Men leaned on railings, chewing tobacco and spitting into the dust. A few of them muttered that the hanging didn't feel right, but none dared say it aloud. In Dry Creek, speaking against the Whitmores was a good way to end up missing. Clara stood in the small cell behind the blacksmith's shop, wrists still bound. A deputy, a boy barely out of his teens, had been told to keep watch. He looked at her with a mixture of pity and fear, as though she were some ghost that might curse him if he met her eyes too long. "Ma'am," he said softly, "you got anyone you want me to send word to?" "A preacher, maybe." She shook her head. "No preacher here would hear me. I'm the devil's wife to them now." The boy swallowed hard. You sure you done it?" Clara looked up sharply, and for the first time her voice cracked. "Doesn't matter if I did or not," she whispered. "They've already decided." Outside, the hammering had stopped. The gallows stood finished. Through the barred window she could see the crowd thickening, neighbors she had cooked for, children she had watched grow. None of them met her gaze. Guilt was a rare thing in Dry Creek. Survival was the only virtue left. Then she heard the measured stomp of boots, heavy, deliberate. The sound of power. Judge Whitmore entered the yard with his eldest son Elias and the preacher, Reverend Hall, trailing behind him. The old man's face was carved from stone, but there was something almost feverish in his eyes. "Bring her out," he ordered. Elias obeyed, yanking open the cell door and gripping Clara's arm hard enough to bruise. She stumbled but caught herself, lifting her chin. The judge watched her as one might a dangerous animal, something to be controlled, not understood. "You've had your time to pray," he said coldly. "Now you'll answer to God and man both." Clara's lips twitched into the ghost of a smile. "If you think God stands with you, Judge, then maybe he's forgotten what mercy means." Gasps rippled through the onlookers, but the judge only tightened his jaw. "Bind her feet," he told his son. "She won't be walking off this time." They led her up the wooden steps. Each board creaked underfoot, the sound echoing across the square. A hot wind tore at her hair, whipping it across her face. Somewhere, a coyote cried in the distance, a lonely sound that sent a shiver through the crowd. The preacher opened his Bible, voice quivering as he read from Psalms, though even he seemed uncertain whether this was prayer or punishment. Clara barely heard him. Her mind wandered to the hills beyond the town, to the memory of cool streams and tall grass, places she would never see again. Below her, whispers stirred. Never thought she'd do it. Heard he beat her near to death some nights. Doesn't matter. A wife's place is to obey. The words were like stones, thrown softly but cutting deep all the same. The judge stepped forward, holding a folded paper. "Here stands Clara Whitmore," he declared, his voice booming across the square, "convicted by witness and circumstance of the murder of her lawful husband. Let all here see that sin carries its due wages." Clara looked out over the crowd, her eyes searching, not for pity, but for truth. There was none. Just faces, blank and hungry for spectacle. When Elias slipped the noose over her neck, the rope felt coarse and heavy, pressing against her throat like the hand of fate itself. The world seemed to narrow, the gallows. The crowd, the burning sky above. Then, from the back of the gathering, a low voice broke the silence. She is innocent. The words were spoken softly but carried like thunder. Heads turned. A young man stood apart from the crowd, his dark hair tied back, his skin bronzed by sun and wind. He wore a faded cavalry coat, too large for him, and a bow slung over one shoulder. The moment eyes fell on him, murmurs began. Apache. Someone hissed. Clara blinked, uncertain whether she was seeing a vision. The young man met her gaze, calm, steady, unafraid. I know who killed her husband, he said, his voice rising. And it was not her. The crowd erupted into shouts, curses, disbelief. The judge's face turned crimson with rage. Get that savage out of here, he barked. But Clara, heart pounding, felt something stir inside her for the first time in days, not hope exactly, but the memory of it. Because when the stranger looked at her again, there was no hatred in his eyes, only truth, and truth, in a place like Dry Creek, was the most dangerous thing of all. For a heartbeat, silence blanketed Dry Creek, the kind of silence that came before thunder or blood. Every man and woman turned to stare at the figure standing at the edge of the square. The stranger was young, no older than 20 summers, but there was something ancient in his stillness. His hair, black as a raven's wing, fell loose to his shoulders. Around his neck hung a string of small turquoise beads, each one dulled by dust and time. His eyes, sharp and steady, were the color of storm clouds gathering over the mesas. The people of Dry Creek saw only what they'd been taught to fear, an Apache, a savage, but Clara, from where she stood on the gallows, saw something else. A man whose gaze did not carry judgment, only quiet certainty. The judge's voice broke the silence first. You dare interrupt the law's work? He thundered, slamming his cane into the ground. This is no place for your kind. The stranger didn't move. Law? He said, his accent rough but his words clear. What law hangs a woman with no proof? What law kills truth to please a lie? A ripple of whispers rolled through the crowd. No one spoke to Judge Whitmore that way, not even the men who owed him their land and lives. The judge narrowed his eyes. State your name. Taza, the young man replied simply. Son of Nanton, scout for the 5th Cavalry. He pointed toward the distant hills where a thin line of smoke rose. Your soldiers know me. I helped them cross Apache land without losing their scalps. That earned a few nervous laughs from the crowd. But Taza didn't smile. I know this woman, he went on, looking at Clara. Last winter, my sister was shot by bandits near this town. The white doctor refused to treat her, said her blood wasn't worth the risk. His eyes hardened. But she came. Clara blinked. The memory returned slowly. A freezing night, the sound of wind through the canyon, and a young Apache girl bleeding from the shoulder. Clara had taken bandages and herbs, ignoring her husband's threats. She'd gone because it was right. She saved my sister, Taza said, voice steady. Gave her food, medicine, life. So when I heard she is to hang, I came to see if white men forgot gratitude as quick as they forget truth. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even a few of the women lowered their eyes in shame. But the judge's face stayed stone. You have no place here, he snapped. No right to speak on white men's justice. Taza stepped forward, slow and deliberate. The men nearest him shifted uneasily, hands brushing the grips of their revolvers. I have every right, he said, because I know who killed the man you mourn. That drew a collective intake of breath. The judge's eyes flared. You speak lies to save her neck. Taza reached into the pouch at his belt and pulled out a small tarnished pocket watch. Gold. Engraved with the initials TW, he held it up so that the sunlight caught it, throwing a glint across the gallows. I found this 3 days ago, he said. At the camp of a trader near Snake Ridge, a man who sells whiskey and guns to any fool who'll buy. He bragged about poisoning a rancher who threatened to turn him in. He said the man choked and died before the night was done. He looked directly at Clara. Was your husband a rancher? Clara nodded slowly, voice trembling. Yes. The crowd began to murmur, louder this time. The blacksmith whispered something to his wife. The preacher's hands shook around his Bible. Even Elias Whitmore shifted uneasily, glancing at his father for guidance. Judge Whitmore's jaw clenched. You expect us to believe the word of an Indian thief? Taza didn't flinch. Believe what you want. The truth doesn't ask permission. The crowd's energy shifted, no longer one of blind certainty but of unease, suspicion. Doubt had entered the air. And once it took root, it grew fast. Let me show you, Taza said, voice calm but unyielding. Come with me to the trader's camp. You'll find more than words there. The judge's cane trembled in his grip. His authority, so absolute moments ago, was slipping through his fingers like dust. He could feel it, the crowd's faith turning, the eyes that once obeyed him now questioning. Enough, he barked. This is a trick. But the murmurs only grew. Someone shouted, let the Apache prove it. Another echoed, ain't no harm in lookin'. Judge Whitmore's face darkened with fury. For the first time in his long life, he realized he might lose control of Dry Creek. Clara's breath came fast. The rope around her neck felt lighter now, not gone, but loosened by the stranger's courage. Taza turned his eyes to her once more, nodding slightly, as if to say, hold on. Truth walks slow, but it walks sure. The desert wind carried his words into silence, and somewhere far off, thunder rumbled across the plains dot by nightfall. The chase for truth would begin. The sun hung high over Dry Creek, burning everything beneath it into silence. Heat shimmered off the gallows wood, warping the air like the breath of some unseen beast. The crowd that had gathered for blood now stood in uneasy clusters, caught between the authority of the judge and the quiet conviction of the Apache, who had dared to challenge him. Judge Whitmore's hand trembled slightly as he gripped his cane. You will not turn this court of law into a circus for savage tailies, he spat. This woman has been judged and the sentence stands. But the murmurs didn't stop. The people of Dry Creek were used to fear, but not doubt. And doubt now seeped through them like water through cracks in stone. The preacher, pale and sweating, stepped forward. Judge, perhaps we might hear him out. If there's truth to what he says, there is no truth in heathen words. The judge snapped. That was when Taza's voice cut through, calm but edged with steel. The man who sold death hides at Snake Ridge, he wears your son's watch on his belt. You can hang this woman and call it justice, or you can come see with your own eyes what justice truly is. He took a step closer, and though he was unarmed except for the knife at his hip, the entire crowd seemed to shift backward as if a storm had moved toward them. Elias Whitmore spat into the dust. You expect us to ride out into Apache country on your say-so? You think we're fools? Taza's eyes flicked to him, dark, unblinking. You're already fools, he said softly. If you hang the wrong one. The wind rose then, scattering sand across the gallows. Hissing through the silence that followed, Clara stood still, every nerve in her body alive with hope and terror. She didn't know whether to trust this stranger, this man who had appeared like a ghost at her hanging. But something in his voice rang true. Not the tone of pleading or self-interest, but of quiet, fierce belief. The blacksmith, A thick-set man with soot-stained hands cleared his throat. "Ain't right to hang a woman when there's questions in the air," he said. "I say we let the Apache show what he's got." Others murmured their agreement. The tension twisted tighter, the air thick with heat and hesitation. Judge Whitmore's face turned crimson. "You'd take the word of an Indian over mine? Over the law of this town?" A woman's voice called out from the back, thin but sharp as a nail. "Ain't your law any more if it kills the innocent?" That single sentence broke something in the air. The crowd began to turn, not all, but enough. Doubt had found its footing. Elias moved toward Taza, his hand dropping to the revolver at his hip. "You shut your mouth, Redskin," he growled. Taza didn't move. His gaze flicked once to Clara, a silent promise, and then back to Elias. "If you think killing me will bring back your brother," he said quietly, "then shoot. But the truth will still be waiting at Snake Ridge." The silence was electric. Even the mules tied to the hitching post shifted nervously, as though sensing something holy or cursed in the air. Finally, the preacher spoke again, his voice trembling but resolute. "If the man speaks true, then let's find out. The good book says, 'The truth shall make you free.'" He looked at the judge. "Let it make her free, or hang her knowing it's right." Judge Whitmore's jaw worked furiously. He could feel control slipping, could see it in the faces around him. The town that had always bowed to his will now stood uncertain, caught between fear and conscience. "Fine," he hissed at last, the word like venom. "We ride. But if this is a lie, Apache, you'll hang beside her." Taza nodded once. "Then I have no fear." The gallows stood empty as the crowd parted, dust swirling in the wake of shifting boots and whispering voices. Clara was pulled down from the platform, her wrists still bound but her spirit unbroken. As she stepped onto the hot earth, Taza met her eyes again. "You saved my sister," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Now truth saves you." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The judge barked orders, "Men fetched horses." And the people of Dry Creek, greedy for certainty, hungry for redemption, began to form a ragged posse. As Taza mounted a paint horse and turned toward the horizon, Clara looked once over her shoulder. The gallows swayed in the hot wind, the noose twisting lazily, a shadow of what might still come. The desert stretched before them, vast and waiting. Somewhere beyond those red cliffs lay a killer, a watch, and the fragile thread of justice. And for the first time since her husband's death, Clara dared to believe that truth might ride with her. The sun was sliding westward when the posse rode out of Dry Creek, a ragged line of men in dust winding through the canyon. The air shimmered with heat, and each hoofbeat seemed to echo off the cliffs like a heartbeat that refused to die. Taz rode near the front, silent, eyes fixed on the horizon. Behind him came Judge Whitmore, his son Elias, the blacksmith, and 3 ranch hands carrying rifles that looked too heavy for their courage. Clara rode at the rear, her wrists finally unbound but her hands trembling on the reins. A borrowed shawl covered her shoulders, but she still felt the phantom weight of the rope against her throat. No one spoke for a long while. The only sounds were the groan of saddle leather, the wheeze of horses, and the wind carrying grit against their faces. Finally, Elias broke the silence. "If this is a trick, Redskin," he called ahead, "I'll gut you myself before the judge's rope does." Taza didn't look back. "If this is a trick," he said evenly, "then may your God strike me dead before we reach the ridge." Elias laughed harshly. "Don't think he'll need to bother." Judge Whitmore said nothing. His jaw was tight, his eyes narrow. He was a man used to control, used to his word being law. But the crowd's defiance that morning had shaken him. The world, once so certain, was now shifting beneath his boots. As they climbed into the canyon, the air cooled. Shadows stretched long across the rocks. Taza guided them with quiet confidence, his horse moving like it knew every turn of the land. Clara couldn't take her eyes off him, not because of his strangeness, but because of his steadiness. He moved like a man who carried truth as surely as a weapon. When they reached the plateau overlooking Snake Ridge, Taza raised a hand. "We ride quiet from here," he said. "The traders' camp is just below that bluff." They dismounted, tying the horses among the scrub. The judge sent one of the ranch hands forward with a rifle, but the man hesitated. Clara could see fear in his eyes. The desert had a way of stripping a person bare, showing exactly what they were made of. Taza crouched low behind a cluster of boulders, motioning for them to follow. Below, the camp lay sprawled in the basin, a crooked tent, a wagon, a half-dead fire. A man moved around it, humming to himself, his shape blurred by heat waves. "There," Taza whispered. "That's him. Calls himself B.O. Randall. Whiskey runner, thief, killer." The judge squinted. "You expect me to take your word he's the one?" Taza didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his satchel and pulled out a small strip of leather. Wrapped inside it was a folded paper, torn, stained, and burned at the edges. He handed it to Clara. She unfolded it with shaking hands. It was a note, the writing rough and scrawled but familiar. T. Whitmore, last warning. Keep your mouth shut about my shipments, or you'll be choking on more than whiskey. Her heart stopped. "It's his handwriting," she whispered. The judge froze. For a moment, his mask of control slipped, replaced by something that looked almost like grief. Taza's voice was quiet but sharp. "He killed your son. Poisoned him to keep his secret safe. I heard him brag at the trading post 2 nights past." Below, the trader tossed another log onto the fire. The faint jangle of a pocket watch carried up the wind, the same golden gleam catching the sunlight. "That's Thomas's watch," Clara said. "I gave it to him for our wedding." Ilias's face twisted with rage. He looked at Taza, then at the camp. "You sure of this?" Taza nodded. "Go see for yourself. But go with care. He's got a gun and a heart full of cowardice." The judge signaled 2 men forward. They crept down the slope, rifles raised. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then, a shout, a scuffle, a gunshot. The trader's voice rang out, high and panicked. "Don't shoot! I didn't mean to kill him. It was an accident. He was gonna talk." The words tumbled into the canyon like stones falling into water. The posse descended on him, wrenching the pistol from his hand. The judge moved stiffly down the slope, cane sinking into the sand. His face ashen. B.O. Randall's eyes darted wildly as they dragged him upright. "He came to me, said he'd tell the law what I was selling to the tribes. I gave him whiskey, just enough to make him quiet." The judge's cane trembled. "You poisoned him." Randall's grin was yellow and sickly. "Man's got to protect his business." The crowd murmured in disbelief. Clara stood frozen. Every word was a blade, cutting through days of accusation, nights of terror, and the memory of her husband's last breath. The truth had come, ugly, raw, undeniable. Taza stood apart from the others, eyes fixed on the horizon. When he finally turned to Clara, there was no triumph in his face, only quiet sorrow. "I told you," he said softly. "Truth walks slow. But it never lies." The judge said nothing. He looked at Clara, really looked at her, and for the first time saw not the enemy of his pride, but the victim of his blindness. Behind them, the sun was sinking red into the desert. The new speck in Dry Creek swayed in the evening wind, waiting for justice that would never come. Evening fell hard over Snake Ridge. The last rays of sunlight bled across the sandstone cliffs, staining the desert red like the memory of old violence. The posse stood in a rough circle around B.O. Randall, the whiskey trader who had just confessed to the crime that had nearly taken an innocent woman's life. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind sighing through the judea, sagebrush, and the rattle of Randall's chains as the blacksmith bound his wrists. Judge Whitmore stood apart, his face ghostly in the fading light. His cane trembled in his hand, and his eyes, once cold as steel, now flickered with something raw and human. Guilt, maybe. Or shame. Clara sat on a rock nearby, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She was shaking, but not from fear. For the first time in weeks, the rope had loosened around her spirit. Yet the freedom she felt was not sweet. It was hollow, edged with disbelief. She looked at Randall, a small man, eyes bloodshot, mouth twisted in a sneer of cowardice. "You murdered my husband," she said softly. Randall snorted. "Your husband was gonna ruin me. Told me he'd take word to the army about my whiskey trade. Couldn't have that." The judge's voice was hoarse. "So you killed him?" Randall shrugged, almost amused. "Didn't mean to. Just meant to make him sleep a while. But he drank too deep." The blacksmith cursed under his breath. Elias, fists clenched at his sides, stepped forward and struck Randall hard across the jaw. The man fell, spitting blood into the dust. "That's for my brother," Elias growled. Randall only laughed, a thin, ugly sound. "Your brother weren't no saint. He was drunk when I met him, just like always." That stopped Elias cold. The truth hit the air like a slap, and for the first time, no one came to Thomas Whitmore's defense. Even the judge's face twitched, his jaw tightening with the weight of what he had long denied. Taz broke the silence. "Enough." His voice carried low but steady, a thread of calm that cut through the storm. "The dead don't need more lies. This man will answer for what he's done, not to fists, but to justice." He turned to Judge Whitmore, meeting his eyes. "Your law will hang him, not her." The words hung in the air, heavy as thunder. The judge said nothing at first. He stared down at Randall, then at Clara, and the years of pride that had hardened him seemed to crack like ice in spring. "I've been a blind fool," he whispered. "I saw what I wanted, not what was true." Clara rose slowly. Her face was pale in the dusk, but her voice was clear. "You saw a woman who didn't fit your world," she said. "You needed a sinner to carry your grief. And I was there." The judge bowed his head, the first gesture of humility anyone had ever seen from him. "You're right," he said quietly. "And I'll carry that sin until my grave." He turned to the men of the posse. "We'll take this man back to Dry Creek. He'll hang at dawn, by law this time." The blacksmith nodded grimly. Two of the ranch hands dragged Randall to his feet, binding him to his horse. His laughter had gone now, replaced by the silence of a man who knew his end was near. As the group began to move, Taza stayed back a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The desert wind carried the scent of rain, rare, distant, but coming. Clara approached him quietly. "You saved me," she said softly. "I don't know how to thank you." Taza shook his head. "You don't owe me thanks. You risked your life to stand against them," she said. "They could have killed you for speaking." He looked at her then, his eyes dark and deep as the canyons around them. "You once saved mine or my sister's, same thing to me. In my people's way, that makes us bound. Life for life." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. "Then we're even," she said, though the words came out hollow, as if she didn't quite believe them. Taza gave a faint smile. "No," he said quietly. "Not even. Just right." They rode back under a sky washed clean of sun, the first stars blinking awake. The night vast and full of quiet reckoning. By the time they reached the outskirts of Dry Creek, word had already spread. Lamps glowed in windows and faces peered from doorways as the posse returned. leading the true killer in chains and the widow once condemned beside them. For the first time, Clara walked through her town not as an outcast, but as a survivor of its sins. The gallows still stood in the square, black against the starlight. Soon, it would serve its rightful purpose. And in the stillness before dawn, the desert itself seemed to whisper a single truth, that justice, though slow, always finds its way home. Dawn came quiet to Dry Creek. The first light crept over the jagged horizon, spilling gold and rose into the valley. The air was still cool, and for a brief moment, the town seemed almost peaceful, as though it had forgotten the gallows that stood in its center like a scar. But the peace was a lie. People were already gathering, drawn by the whispers that had traveled faster than the wind. The real killer had been caught. The widow was innocent. Justice, long twisted by pride and fear, was finally staggering toward truth. B.O. Randall, the whiskey trader, was dragged up the gallows steps by two of the judge's men. His eyes darted everywhere, searching for sympathy, for escape, but found none. The crowd that had once cheered for Clara's death now looked on with silent disgust. His arrogance had drained away with the night. Judge Whitmore stood at the platform's edge, his black coat heavy in the rising sun. The years on his face seemed to have doubled overnight. The proud man who'd once ruled this town with his voice and cane now spoke like one carrying a burden too heavy to bear. "This man," he said, his voice rough, "has confessed to the murder of my son, Thomas Whitmore." A ripple of sound moved through the crowd. Gasps, mutters, a mother's whisper to her child. The judge continued, his tone steady but hollow. "I allowed grief to blind me. I called an innocent woman guilty because it suited my pain. For that, I beg the mercy of the Almighty and of her." He turned then, facing Clara. She stood at the foot of the gallows, dressed now in a plain blue dress someone from town had lent her. Her hair, freed from its bindings, caught the early light like dark silk. Her hands trembled, but she didn't hide them. The whole town had already seen her at her weakest. Now they would see her stand. "Mrs. Whitmore," the judge said quietly, "I cannot undo what I did, but I can give back what I took, your name, your honor, your life." The crowd parted as he descended the steps and approached her. Then, with deliberate motion, he held out his cane, a symbol of his authority. The law he'd twisted and laid it at her feet. It was the closest thing to an apology a man like him could give. Clara looked down at it for a long moment, then raised her eyes to him. Her voice, when it came, was soft but carried clear across the square. "I forgive you," she said. "Not because you deserve it, but because I need to be free." The judge bowed his head. Then he turned to the crowd, lifting a hand toward the gallows. "The law will do its duty. Let no one say justice sleeps in Dry Creek again." B.O. Randall began to shake. "You can't hang me," he rasped. "I didn't mean to. It was an accident." But no one listened. The blacksmith stepped forward, grim-faced, and pulled the lever. The sound of the drop was sharp and final. When it was done, silence blanketed the town again. Not the silence of fear this time, but of reckoning. Clara turned away. Her eyes didn't follow the swinging shadow. She had seen enough death to last 10 lifetimes. As she stepped down from the platform, she caught sight of Taza at the edge of the square. He hadn't come close, he never did, but he stood there on horseback, a still figure against the dawn, watching. Their eyes met across the distance. For a long moment, neither moved. The crowd, the gallows, the town, all of it seemed to fade away. Then Taza inclined his head, not as a man seeking thanks, but as one acknowledging something sacred and wordless between them. Clara lifted her hand slightly in return, and just like that, he turned his horse and rode toward the open desert, the rising sun framing his silhouette in gold. The judge's men began to dismantle the gallows as the town slowly dispersed. The rope came down last, coiled and set aside like a venomous thing. Finally, Defanged. Clara stood alone in the dust, the morning light warm on her face. The gallows that had once waited for her now stood empty, its shadow shrinking with the sun. The rope had fallen away, and though her life had been torn apart and remade by the cruelty of men, Clara felt something stir deep within her, not joy, not triumph, but peace, the kind that comes when the storm has passed and the desert breathes again. She looked once more to the horizon where Taza had vanished and whispered a prayer to whatever power had sent him her way. Then she turned toward her home, or what remained of it, ready to begin again. Weeks passed before the town of Dry Creek learned to speak of what had happened without shame. The gallows was torn down plank by plank. Its wood burned in the churchyard one gray morning as if fire could cleanse the memory of what it had almost done. The townsfolk watched the flames with bowed heads, whispering prayers that felt more like apologies than absolution. Clara Whitmore stood apart from them, her hands tucked into the pockets of her worn dress, her eyes fixed on the smoke curling into the pale blue sky. It felt strange to breathe free air again, stranger still to feel people's eyes on her without the weight of accusation behind them. Some nodded as she passed now. Some even offered bread or kind words. But forgiveness from a crowd was never as healing as forgiveness from within, and Clara was still learning how to let her heart unclench. The judge, she heard, had resigned from his post. He spent his days on the hill by his son's grave, a man made small by the truth. He had written Clara a letter she couldn't bring herself to open, not yet. Some wounds healed slow, like the desert after rain. Her cabin at the edge of town had gone quiet. The land Thomas once worked now grew wild, the fences falling, the grass reclaiming what man had taken. Clara didn't mind. She found peace in the silence. She spent her mornings walking the Dry Creek bed, her afternoons tending a small garden, her nights watching the stars emerge over the mesas like old friends returning home. But sometimes, in the hush between dusk and dark, her mind drifted back to him, to Taza, the stranger who had stepped from the dust and spoken truth when no one else dared. She'd expected never to see him again. The world had a way of swallowing men like him, brave, restless souls who belonged more to the horizon than to any one place. Still, she found herself scanning the ridges whenever she rode into town, searching for a shape against the skyline. Then, one evening, he returned. It was near sundown. The air was red and gold, the heat softened by a wind that smelled faintly of rain. Clara was hauling water from the well when she saw a figure approach along the ridge. Tall, quiet, steady. For a moment she thought it was a dream conjured by loneliness. But when he drew closer, she saw the turquoise beads at his neck, the same calm in his eyes that she remembered. "Taza," she said softly, setting the bucket down. He smiled faintly. "You remembered. I owe you my life. Hard to forget a man who gives that back." He looked around the little patch of land, the half-tilled earth, the flowers blooming stubbornly against the dust. "You made this place live again." She shrugged. "It was always alive. Just needed someone to stop fighting it." He nodded, understanding in his silence. After a moment, she asked, "What brings you back?" He tilted his head toward the west. "The army moved on. I came to see if the land still remembers peace." His eyes softened as they met hers. "And to see if you do." Clara's throat tightened. "I'm trying," she admitted. "Some nights I still wake up hearing the rope creak in the wind." Taza looked toward the horizon. "The rope's gone," he said quietly. "Only the sky remembers." They stood like that for a while, two survivors of different worlds, bound by a single act of courage neither could forget. Finally, Clara broke the silence. "You could stay a while. The garden's small, but there's always work. And supper." He smiled, a small, weary, genuine smile. You'd feed an Apache in a town that tried to hang you for less? She met his gaze evenly. I don't take lessons in hate anymore. For a long heartbeat, the only sound was the rustle of wind through dry grass. Then Taza nodded once. Then I'll stay for supper. As the sun sank behind the mesas, they sat together by the porch, a widow and a warrior, watching the desert shift from gold to violet. No words were needed. The silence between them was its own kind of peace out above them. The stars bloomed bright and patient, the same ones that had watched over every act of cruelty and mercy the world had ever known. The gallows was gone. The rope had burned. But something stronger had taken its place, a bond forged in fire and truth, in kindness given and repaid and in the heart of the desert. Beneath a sky endless and forgiving, two souls, both scarred, both reborn, found that redemption, like love, is not spoken. It is lived.